Hi everyone, this is Mindy Eggen for Fawn, and in today's video, we are going to be making an underwater window shaker card. So the first thing I did when I was starting to think about the design of this card is I took the two die cutting plates that I wanted to use and the stamp sets and laid them all out here like I show you on screen. That's just going to let me know which stamp sets I'm going to use and which ones are going to fit in my windows. Then I'm going to move all those stamps over to some 80-pound white cardstock that I'm going to be stamping with my Misty stamping tool, and I will be stamping them in the Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink. So I'm using images from Mermaid for You, Fintastic Friends, I Like You a Lotl, Seahorsing Around, and So Jelly. A lot of these are the small stamp sets, which are super affordable. So once you start kind of combining them, you can really create some great scenes. I'm going to stamp them twice just to make sure I'm getting really good solid lines because I will be Copic coloring these images later on. Now, also in the Mermaid for You, I believe the stamp set is that has these solid pieces of seaweed and coral, and I am going to stamp these in a variety of colors of inks. So starting with the freshly cut grass, these are all going to be Lawn Fawn inks. And then I'm going to stamp some in Peacock. I'm also going to stamp a set in Peachy Keen and then another set in Rainforest, which I think is a beautiful color to use for your underwater things like the seaweed. For this one, I wanted to stamp a few of these in the same color, which is the Rainforest ink. So I'm just shifting my cardstock over in my Misty tool to be able to get both sides of this small piece of cardstock. I'm going to set this off on the side to die cut out later on, and I'm going to move on to work on the Copic coloring portion of the video. I'll start by coloring these smaller seaweed images, and for that I am starting with YG01, filling in all those small areas, and then I'm going to come in with YG07 and add just a little bit of a line on one side of each of those pieces on the seaweed. That's just hopefully going to add a little bit of contrast to that small image. I'll move on to coloring the hair of my mermaid, and I'm going to use the same colors for both mermaids just to keep this kind of simple for me. I'm starting with E79 and adding these flicks of hair, the ones that are by her face, and I'm going to flick that up. And then I like to turn my cardstock and go to the other side of her hair and flick that in. So the flicks are going to kind of meet in the middle. So I'm using E79 as the darkest color, E77, E74, and then adding in the E35 as kind of my highlight area. I'll use this same color combination on my second mermaid here. Now, I did try and get a little bit creative with the highlight area. I wanted to have, I guess, kind of more of mermaid hair, and I was going to try and add a BV04 as the highlight or the last color that I would be using. Unfortunately, I did not really care for how it turned out. I think it just was too dull of a color. If I might have chosen maybe a brighter purple, that would have worked out a little better. But you'll see here, I filled that in. It just wasn't quite feeling it. So I'm going to come back in with all of those same colors. And this time I'm going to color over it. And it does hide it pretty good. So she's going to have a little bit darker of hair than my other mermaid. So once I finish up with the hair of the mermaid, I'm going to move on to coloring the skin. And for the skin, I will be using E04, E11, and E01. The E04 I'm going to add right under the hairline, so right where the hair would be kind of overhanging the face a little bit, just adding a little bit, and then I blend that out with the E11 and E01. I did forget the waistline at first, but I will come back in and fill that area in too. I'll then move on to that little sandcastle, and I'm going to color that in just some light browns real quick, starting with the E42, and then I'm going to add a shadow area to one side of it with E44. For the bodies of the mermaid, once again, I'm going to color them both in the same color just to keep it simple. For this, I'm going to be using BG49, BG45, and BG11. So I'm just picking a side to add that darkest color to. For this top one, I added the darkest shade to the right-hand side. And for this one that's going to be sitting on the rocks, I added that BG49 to her left side and then blended that out. For a couple of these images, I'm going to bring out another set of alcohol markers. So I didn't provide the numbers for these just yet, but these are Olo markers. They're something new that's coming to the market. I have a few of them here that I wanted to kind of test out how they were feeling, how they color and things like that. And usually yellows are really hard for me to find a good color combination. So that's what I had for these Olo markers. You really can use any color combination, any type of alcohol marker, or maybe colored pencils. You can use whatever you want to color in your images. I'll move on to coloring my fish. So this one, I'm doing some yellow on the fish, and I'll come back to finish the stripe. I'm doing this little school of fish in orange, adding a little bit of a light and dark color to the bottom of those. And then I have this little seahorse. I didn't end up using it on my card, but I left in the coloring for you just in case, using RV14, RV13, and RV10, and then a little bit of yellow for the back of the seahorse. I'm going to come in with dark blues to finish off my little fish. And I'm going to use some dark grays or some warm grays to color in my rock. Now, since my mermaid is going to be sitting on this and I have it kind of where the light source is coming from the right-hand side, I'm going to put my darkest color on the left-hand side of this rock and then blend that out. So once I have everything completely colored in, I'm going to line up the coordinating dies for each of these, hold it down with a low tack tape or post-it tape, and then for some of these smaller pieces where I stamp them in a colored ink, I'm going to have to die cut those multiple times. The dies that I'll be using to create my background is the stitched wavy backdrop in the landscape, and then the foursquare backdrop in landscape as well. So I die cut these out of Mermaid cardstock, and they're going to layer on top of each other. I'm going to do some ink blending to my background using some Distress Oxide inks, and I'm just working on a silicone mat to kind of hold this cardstock in place a little bit while I do my ink blending. So I'm starting with Peacock Feathers Distress Oxide ink. I started maybe about a third of the way down or about halfway down, and I'm blending so it's going to fade into the Mermaid cardstock. So that's why I started with a colored cardstock, a little bit less ink blending that I need to do. Then I'm going to take my blueprint sketch. I'm going to turn my cardstock. This is just easier for me. I like to ink blend this way. And then I'm going to put on that blueprint sketch towards the very bottom, blend that up into the peacock feathers. And I wanted this to be just a little bit darker towards the bottom. I had started with prize ribbon. I brought that in at first, but once I started ink blending that over the blueprint sketch, it really wasn't enough of a difference for me. It wasn't quite dark enough. So I switched it up and I went into chipped sapphire. So chipped sapphire is pretty dark. That did add quite a bit of contrast for me. And I'm going to come back in with the blueprint sketch a little bit to kind of help smooth out that transition of color. And once I'm happy with this blend, I'm going to set it off on the side and work on that frame that I cut from the foursquare backdrop. So I'm going to ink blend the same colors kind of in the same direction where it's going to be, I'm going to have a darker color towards the bottom and kind of have it fade up into the mermaid color of the cardstock. So starting with the blueprint sketch. Now this can be a little tricky, which is why it's nice to work on the silicone mat or something that's going to kind of grip your cardstock. You don't want to ink blend too hard because as you can see, this can kind of buckle. So I did the blueprint sketch and the peacock feathers on that frame. Now, before I do anything else, I want to glue most of these items together or into the window because to create our shaker card, we are going to be adding a piece of acetate behind that window. And it's just easier for me to kind of get this started so I don't have to worry about tucking things in later on. So I'm going to start gluing some of these pieces together. I have the seaweed tucked behind that little sandcastle, and I have my mermaid attached to that rock, which is going to go behind the frame. Now, some of my pieces are going to sit on top of that acetate, so I'm going to put them off on the side and I'll attach them later on. When I had arranged everything originally after I did the ink blending, I took a picture of it with my camera. I apologize. I thought I left that in the video, but I did not. But I took a picture with my camera and then I have that sitting off on the side so I can reference that. So that way I don't forget where I had maybe little pieces of seaweed or what colors I had in there because I like to have a variety of color of seaweed in there. Once I have everything glued in place, I'm going to line the entire back of this frame and the middle pieces, plus my images, with 1/8 of an inch double-sided tape. This just is going to help make sure it secures really good to the acetate. So I'm peeling off the backing of all of that double-sided tape, and then I have a piece of acetate that I cut to a little bit smaller, just a hair smaller than the frame, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So I'm taking that acetate and I'm going to line it up with my bottom left-hand corner and edge, and then just push down really well, make sure this is secured together. And if there's any acetate overhanging because maybe I just misaligned, I can always trim that off later on. I'm going to create my shaker well using these foam strips. They're really skinny foam strips, which are great for these window pieces. You could also die cut out this foursquare backdrop using multiple pieces of cardstock and layer it up together that way. But I just went around the entire frame and also the middle a little bit there to support it using 2 layers of those foam strips. Just make sure that when you're adding foam strips that you're not leaving any gaps for the shaker bits to fall out. Now, one thing I do want to say before adding your shaker bits to this well is you want to go around the edges of that foam tape with your anti-static embossing tool so that way you can remove some of the stickiness. I completely forgot. So here I was just adding a variety of sequins and sparkles and things like that to the center. And then I had to kind of push that towards the inside, which everything wanted to stick to my fingers to try and get my anti-static powder tool in there. And that just helps so that my shaker bits don't stick so much to the side. Now I can come in, remove the backing of that foam, and I'm going to place my backdrop over this. I'm going to make sure that the orientation is correct. So I want the darker part of my background to be towards the bottom of the card, which is where one of my mermaids is. So I'm going to line this up with the bottom left-hand corner, just kind of following the edge of that. Make sure everything is really nice and straight. And once again, if I need to trim anything off because I misaligned, I can always do that now before I add it to a card base. So off screen, I created a top folding card base out of 110-pound white cardstock. This is going to measure 4¼ by 5½. I added tape runner all around the edge and quite a bit in the center because if you notice with the stitched backdrop die, it does have openings there, like if you wanted to tuck anything inside of the stitched waves there. So I just made sure to add adhesive quite a bit on my front panel. And now I can come back in and add in my other pieces like the mermaid or the starfish and my little school of fish. And this is just getting added with the tape runner right on top of the acetate. After I finish that, I'm going to give it a quick little shake, make sure everything is looking just as cute as I had hoped it would. And then I'm going to add some little details to this. And one of those is going to be by using my white gel pen to add some highlights to the edges of my mermaid. Sometimes I'll just do little dots like on the seaweed because it's such a small area. So just adding a few white dots going around the fish and up on top in that last square with some dots once again. The sentiment that I'm going to be using for the front of my card comes off of the Mermaid for You stamp set. It says waving hello, and I'm going to stamp this on some mermaid cardstock. I'm going to prep that with my anti-static powder tool, ink this up in the Yeti white pigment ink because it does stay wet quite a while. So I'm going to stamp it twice, make sure I have a good impression, not pushing too hard so I don't distort my words. Then I'll sprinkle on my white embossing powder, tap off any of that excess, and I'm holding my cardstock with a clothespin while I heat emboss that so I don't get my fingers burnt. And then I'm lining up this banner die to trim out my sentiment. I'm going to add a little bit of color to this using the colors that I used in my background, starting with the peacock feathers. And I'm just using the leftover ink that's on my blending tool. I didn't re-ink this at all. Because we heat emboss that heat embossing is going to resist that ink. So here is the blueprint sketch. And then I'm going to buff over that with just a paper towel to bring my white embossing powder back front and center. I will line up some thin foam squares behind my sentiment. I did also trim off kind of that flag end because I decided to put my sentiment right in the middle of my card. So that is going to finish up my card, and then I'm going to give it a couple really good shakes, make sure everything is moving around in there. Shaker cards are just so much fun, and then using it in an underwater scene with this window, I think is so super cute. I really love this, and I'm definitely going to be making more of these. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. The supplies used will be listed down below in the video description. Thank you so much for joining me today. Have a great day.